Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Mythic Mission podcast. My name is Michael Jahosky, and I'm a humanities professor at St. Petersburg College here in Florida, and the author of The Good News of the Return of the King, The Gospel in Middle Earth. Here on Mythic Mission, I'm dedicated to bringing you a Christian apologetic that appeals to both the imagination and to the intellect. Now, I believe the Bible shows us that God loves myth, and so here at Mythic Mission, I will be bringing you content that shows the importance of story in Christian apologetics, evangelism, and discipleship, particularly through the works of J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Please subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform and to our YouTube channel. Please also consider checking out the WordPress for Mythic Mission's website, which you can find in the description and also on the content page for YouTube and any of your favorite podcast platform. So I am thrilled and absolutely honored and pleased to introduce a new friend, Dr. Louis Markos, today. He's our first guest for the Mythic Mission podcast. I couldn't have thought of a better person to kick off this wonderful podcast, and one of my favorite authors I've read down through the years. I've read many, probably not all of his books, and he is professor of English and scholar in residence at Houston Baptist University, where he holds the Robert H. Ray Chair in Humanities. He is a very popular speaker and a wonderful professor. I hear has delivered well over 300 public lectures on such topics as C.S. Lewis, ancient Greece, and ancient Rome, as well as Dante in some 24 states and also in Oxford, Rome, and British Columbia. He is committed to the concept of the professor as public educator and believes that knowledge must not be walled up in the academy, but must be disseminated to all who have ears to hear. And I could not agree with him more. So thank you, Louis, for coming on the show. I really appreciate you being here. Thank
Thanks
you.
for having me on, Michael, and bravo to this idea. We need
Yeah.
myth.
Yes, we do. Absolutely. So on that note, we'll get to the concept of myth in a minute, but I would just love to hear a little bit more from you. I'm kind of nerding out here. I get to hear from you about your book that I have right by my side here, The Myth Made Fact, reading Greek and Roman mythology through Christian eyes. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how you came to the idea of writing the book and your own synopsis, if you like?
Well, I'll tell you, I love these myths, Michael, and these myths are part of me, not only because I'm a man of the West, but I
Mm.
actually am Greek, right? All
Yeah.
four of my grandparents are born in Greece. My parents now live in Tarpon Springs, Florida, very close to
Mhm.
where you live and where the
Mhm.
school is.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, I really grew up with these myths as my mother's milk. I've always loved them.
Mm.
Now, I think about 12 years ago, I published a book with IVP called From Achilles to Christ, Why Christians Should Read the Pagan Classics. And I
Yes.
focus on the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, and the Greek tragedies.
Mhm.
And I love doing that. It's one of my favorite books. But I was starting to feel like, let's go a little bit deeper
Mm.
because behind Homer and Virgil and Sophocles and Aeschylus and Euripides is the real raw material of Greco and later Greco Roman myth. And so I said, let's go right to the source. We
Yes.
live in an age, and I'm very much committed to apologetics and to evangelism, as I know you are, Michael.
Mhm.
And if we want to reach this generation, this is a generation that they're no longer looking for the scientific, logical apologetic. They're looking for myth. They're looking for a story to be a part of. That's why
Yes.
there would be no Hollywood and maybe no TV if it wasn't for Marvel superheroes. And I mean, superheroes are
Yes.
just the new myths of today.
Yes,
And
they
so I
are.
really felt the need. I want to dig in and explore these myths and
Mm.
appreciate them in and of themselves, but then also look at what they can teach Christians, how a Christian's faith can
Mm.
actually be strengthened by meditating on these stories. And my book is composed of 50 myths,
Mhm.
and each one I start by retelling the story in my own storytelling voice. And then I give a full analysis of it and the Christian implications. But then later on, there are all sorts of study questions
Mhm.
of how to apply this, how to dig in. And so this is a book that can be read by, for high school or middle school or even grammar school. It can be read by homeschoolers. It can be read devotionally, read one or two at night and
Mhm.
focus on the questions, the scripture verses, and allow these myths to help us wrestle with the big questions. Who am I? Why am I here? What is my purpose? How do I know
Yes.
my value? Etc. Etc.
Yes. Wonderful. I've really enjoyed the book. And by the way, I will have a link in the YouTube description and the podcast description to where you can find Dr. Markos's book. I believe it's available on Amazon, Classical Academic Press, anywhere fine books are sold, and really encourage you to read it. This is a much needed subject. And I couldn't agree more. The reason why I started the podcast, and my wife and I really had the idea, by the way, she did the excellent graphic behind me. That was all her creativity. I can't do that stuff. So she's the artist. And she and I really agree with you here that, the evidentialist, rationalist approach to apologetics is very important. But I think you'll agree with me that it's subsumed and kind of enfolded in the mythological approach already. And so if we start to put that first, I mean, really, truly a mythological, mythos and logos, it's that compound word of both of them together. A myth delivers that logos material that people still want, but I think they really want their imagination stirred and baptized, as I think Lewis once said. So I agree with you, and this book really does everything that you said it does, and will be a great help to Christians seeking to not only understand these Greco-Roman myths through Christian eyes, but to understand them. You've done an excellent job summarizing them and retelling them. Because a lot of that subject matter where they come from is complex. So thank you for that.
Thanks.
Yeah,
It was a labor of love.
yeah, it shows, and I love the cover, by the way, as well. I think that's Icarus on there.
Yeah.
So great book, highly recommended. That's why we've had you on the show, and also to talk about, because I know you love this subject, to talk about myth. And as we just alluded to, this is a Greek word, mythos. It's very ancient. It goes back to Hesiod and Homer, some of the 8th and 7th century BC poets. But this term is grossly misunderstood today. And I think though people crave and want more of a imaginative approach to the Christian faith, I think into many religions, most people don't understand this term. In my classroom, I can tell you, we have a whole chapter in Intro to Humanities, and I spend several weeks trying to unpack this term and the connection between myth and truth and reality and even basic philosophical concepts that people are still struggling to grasp. But myth is, as I'm sure you get this a lot too, maybe you can confirm whether you do or not, is an untrue story for a lot of people. And so how can we help clarify
It's
that?
crazy. I'll tell a story that I tell somewhere in the book. It's a true story, and it's actually took place in Florida. I told you my parents live in Florida,
Yeah,
and there was a evangelist. I'm not going to say his name. He was a
sure.
good man of God, led a lot of people to Christ. He's passed away since. It was a while ago.
Mm-hmm.
Older man, led a lot of people to Christ, but on his radio program, he was telling people, don't read C.S. Lewis, he's bad. And so I was in town, so somebody asked me to sit down and talk with him. And as I expected, he hadn't actually read any C.S. Lewis. He read something on the web about C.S. Lewis. That wasn't a surprise. The surprise came when I asked him, I said, so sir, what have you read by C.S. Lewis? Have you read the Chronicles of Narnia? And his answer, as always, stayed in my mind. He said, ever since I became a believer 40 years ago, I have not read a single work of fiction. Now, he hadn't even read any Christian fiction. He hadn't even read the Left Behind series, which is probably a good thing, actually.
Yeah.
But what was going on? Now, it took me a long time to process this. Now, he was a lot older than me, so I didn't want to be a young whippersnapper. Otherwise, I would have said to him, you do realize that the parables of Jesus are fictional, right? They're fictional. But I didn't say that. I left, I went home, and the revelation hit me, Michael. If you were to ask that man, why don't you read fiction? He would have said, because I'm a Christian. But I want to argue here at the beginning here that the real reason he doesn't read fiction, the reason he doesn't know, is that he's a modernist and doesn't realize it.
Yes.
He has bought in, as most of us has, Christian or non-Christian, into what's often called the Enlightenment split. The modern world does not begin in the Renaissance, as Lewis helped us understand. It begins with the Enlightenment. And during the Enlightenment, this split happened, a split between, on one side, reason, imagination, logic, intuition, history, myth, science, religion, everything. And it's often called the facts value split. Either it's a fact or a value, and there's nothing in between. Michael, I have a lot of respect for the Christians in the early part, around 1900, who were fighting the good fight against Darwinism, the way they were trying to demolish biblical authority. But even though I applaud them, They made a category error.
Mhm.
They agreed to argue on the secular humanist ground. They
Yeah.
bought into the lie that
Mhm.
something is only true if it's scientifically, logically, mathematically true, what we call logical positivism.
That's right.
And
That's right.
how can you make the Bible stand up to a verification system that has only existed for 250 years? Now,
Precisely.
again, the Bible tells us history,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it tells us a lot about science,
Yeah.
but it's not meant to be a textbook. Michael,
Sure.
if God wanted to write a textbook, there would be one gospel, not four. Okay?
Exactly.
So
Yes.
it's not
Amen.
a textbook.
That's
And
right.
we're
That's
still
right.
struggling with it, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, one of my favorite definitions of biblical inerrancy
Mm.
is this, that the Bible is true in what it affirms. And what that
Hmm.
means is when the
Yes.
Bible's being historical, we take it historical.
That's
When
right.
it's being poetic, we take it poetic. Now, as Christians, we can often disagree, right?
Sure.
I think you can make it, I believe there was a real Job. But I think you could make a legitimate argument within real biblical authority and authenticity and inerrancy
Hmm.
that Job is a parable writ large.
Absolutely. Now,
You can't do that with Abraham. That's a historical
no,
figure.
no.
But there are
Yeah.
places you can do that.
Oh,
And so
absolutely.
we're fighting this split all the time.
All the
Even
time.
Christians, we've bought into this idea that
Yes.
if I use the word myth, that means it's not true.
Right.
And so I can't use the word myth about the Bible in any sense.
Oh boy, we're
We just don't
confused.
understand what words mean.
Yeah, no, that's a critical problem. So that's why we're here to talk about it today. Now, you just mentioned your definition of inerrancy. I hold to that as well. I think I first encountered that actually in a work of Norman Geisler, who I know since
Ah,
passed, but
okay.
something to that extent. He said the Bible is true in everything that it affirms. But this also reminded me that this is the actual original, or maybe the first layer of the definition literal. To take something literally would mean to take it for what it's claiming to be. If it's historical, to take
Right,
something that's historical, I mean, to take it as history would be to take it literally, vice
right,
versa. So if it's poetry, to take it literally, which would be, of course, a confusing thing to say to a modern person, but
right,
it would mean simply to take it seriously as poetry and as
right.
mythos. And so I think that's a very important clarification we've just made. Thank you. And
I
I
mean,
heard,
we all, evangelicals, we all understand Jesus's use of Semitic hyperbole. When
yes,
Jesus says, unless you hate your father and mother, you can't be my disciple. Well,
right,
that can't be taken in our sense of the word literal, because it
no,
would then contradict honor thy father and thy mother, the first
absolutely,
commandment that comes with a blessing, right?
absolutely,
So we,
yeah,
we do need to understand the literary technique used, but
yes,
still, but I even see some modern scholars who are trying to help. They say, well, look, Augustine didn't take the Garden of Eden literally. Well, actually, they
mm,
obviously haven't read the City of God carefully,
mm,
because Augustine, as an early church father, when he reads the story of the garden, he takes it on four levels of meaning. The
mhm.
literal's always there, the
Yes,
historical is there,
right.
but within it is an allegorical and what they call the moral meaning and what they call the spiritual or anagogical meaning.
That's
We
right. Yeah.
need to
Yeah.
learn to read, beautiful word, Michael. We
Yeah.
need to read the Bible polysemously.
I love that word.
Polysemous,
Yeah.
poly means many, of course, like semiotics means signs.
Right.
So many signs. It means all of these things
Mm,
at the same time. So the
beautiful.
story of the Passover
Mm,
is a historical story about a
yes.
historical event,
Yep.
but it's also allegorically the gospel, because
Yes.
we're all ready to be destroyed by the angel of death when we come to judgment. But if
Yes.
we take the perfect spotless lamb, that's Jesus, we
Mm,
take his blood and put it not on our doorpost but on ourselves,
hmm.
then when we come before God, we literally pass out of judgment, right? So
Yes.
those meanings are both there. That doesn't take away from the fact that the Passover actually happened at a time and place in
No,
history,
that's
but it
right.
also has another dimension of meaning.
Mm,
So it's we want to call
wow.
it a true allegory. We'll talk later about a true myth,
Yeah.
but it's
Yeah.
allegorical and historical at the same time. And that's how people used to read the Bible
And I
until the modern.
think, and I think that is a beautiful word, polysemously. The problem is the fact value, or that sacred secular split, is that we can't hold. We're uncomfortable with paradoxical thinking and mythological thinking today. And so we want to put them in separate jail cells. And we can't understand how it can be, as you said, Passover is a great example, historical and allegorical, and have this mythological element where this might have been a story that happened one time in history, but it happens all the time in another sense. So that's beautiful.
I'm glad you added
Yeah.
sacred secular, because
Yeah.
Mike, you and I are both professors, and we
Mhm.
know that another part of the split is this idea of public private.
Oh, yes.
Unfortunately, the modern world has decided that anything having to do with religion is private.
Yeah.
And therefore, if you bring anything about Christianity to the classroom, that's like coming into your class and telling them details about your wife or something
Sure.
that you wouldn't
Yeah.
tell. But we don't understand that Christianity is also a worldview that has
Yes.
implications
Yes.
for everything we teach and everything we say. So
That's right.
this split is very, very pervasive.
It's dug
And
in.
this is one of the ways we can break it down.
Yes.
And
Amen to that.
integrate
Yes.
the parts of ourselves.
Yes. To remythologize. And I know we both have talked about this, and Tolkien was really big on fairy and its ability, fairy story and its ability to recover. And that's what we need, is a recovery of a true understanding of reality. So it's beautiful. This is we could talk about this subject for hours. I've got some other things I know we want to get to. But this is great. We've set up a couple of other subjects here. Maybe very simply, we can probably agree on this. We've read a lot of the same people, but for those of us out there that may not be philosophically, inclined, my understanding is that truth is a statement or proposition about fact or reality. That's how you understand it as well, I'm sure. So, for a lot of people, I think they might struggle with that when it comes to the imaginative or the mythological or the supernatural, because now we start to get into the territory of how something that can be supernatural or imaginative or spiritual even, how can it be true? And also, how can it ultimately be about reality? And therefore, how can it be real? I mean, these unicorns don't exist. Orestes probably wasn't a real person. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. I think people, of course, they look at Jesus the same way, and it's a problem. So I guess the ultimate question here is maybe to talk a little bit about truth as it relates to reality, and then we'll get into maybe after that how something that is real to the imagination, can be true. I think you see the direction I'm going in here.
Right.
So
It's
this is
interesting because
yeah.
What's happened, especially amongst liberal Christianity, going back to a guy named Rudolf Bultmann, is if you go back to the early church, there were people like there were not only the Christians, but there were Jews like Philo, there were Neoplatonists like Porphyry and Plotinus, that they loved the myths, right? Some of the crazy ones. And they knew that those myths were wild and really not historical at all.
Right.
But they saw truth in them. So they would allegorize them and look for a deeper truth. Now, what Bultmann does is, the Bible too is only a myth. And so all I care about is the deeper meaning. But what Lewis and Tolkien and Chesterton and others helped us understand is that what's unique about Christianity is it's a true myth. In other words, it actually happened at a time and a place under Pontius Pilate, as Lewis reminds us. But why is it still a myth? Because a myth is a reflection on deeper realities, on origins, on destinations. And think about all the myths in Plato. Most of them are either about the origin of things or about the afterlife, even including a kind of transmigration of souls. But
that's right.
Most of the myths, and they're about journeys from darkness to light, from ignorance to truth. And the way Lewis, I pulled out the book. Only Lewis could say it this way. He said, okay, what flows into you from the myth is not truth, but reality. Truth is always about something, but reality is that about which truth is. Okay? So what you're just saying, truth is a statement about reality, but it's not that reality itself. There is a deeper reality. And, again, we know we're ridiculous when we say something is only real if we can see it, smell it, taste it, touch it, what they call empiricism. John Locke. right?
Sure.
And unfortunately, as a conservative, I'm supposed to worship John Locke because of the good influence he had on our founding fathers. But he
Sure.
made a lot of mistakes in philosophy, so let's be careful,
Yes.
about him,
Amen to
right?
that.
But
Yes,
anyway,
exactly.
it's a blessing, right? But
Yeah, that's right.
John Locke says that there's no innate ideas. What do you mean there's no innate? We're born with a deep set yearning. We're born with conscience. All of these things are written into us, right?
Mm-hmm.
When people say that, it's like, well, what about love? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Can we see or smell or taste or touch that? And yet that's not important. I mean, we don't really live our lives this way.
Yes.
We say it when we want to brush things under the carpet and don't want to deal with them directly.
Yes.
Is a direct meditation. And
Mm.
again, just think about Plato. Plato's the guy who kicked the poets out of the Republic in Book 10 of the Republic, but he's the greatest poet of all time, the
Yes.
greatest myth maker of all time. And so he tries to explain the idea of the forms in a very abstract way, but when he gives us the famous allegory of the cave, suddenly it comes real. See, Lewis explained it in many. Lewis was really influenced by a book by a guy named Alexander. Nobody reads this book anymore, but he talks about how we can't really enjoy something and study it at the same time.
Tragic dilemma. Yes.
Michael, I don't know if you do that. We professors we're on a vacation and we keep asking ourselves, am I having fun yet? Well, the more you try to analyze your experience, you're not having the experience, right? And what's wonderful about myth, in the best myths, we're actually doing both. Now, if we overanalyze the myth gets robbed of its power and becomes only an allegory.
Yeah.
But as long as we accept the myth, as a sub-creation, we're talking about on fairy stories by Tolkien, if we accept it as a myth, that's why in many ways Lewis said, don't tell your kids all the parallels between Aslan and Christ.
Right.
Let them experience Aslan. Let them feel a certain way towards Aslan. And then when they're old enough, they can transfer that feeling to its proper object, at least in our world.
That's right. Yeah.
You've got a daughter, don't you?
I do. I've got a son and a daughter. Yeah.
Right. Sometimes we give girls dolls to play with, right?
Right. Yep.
Dolls are like babies in training. Right? Obviously, we know the doll's not real. The little girl knows the doll's not real, but she is learning to invest a certain emotion or love on this figure that in time will be moved over to a fuller object, right?
That's right. But, yeah.
So again, myth is Lewis calls it an isthmus between the two.
Yes, I remember that.
It's a way of getting to those deeper realities, those deeper truths. It's how we ask big questions and how we wrestle with them. And again, we're doing. And the funny thing about it is, when you look at what was the last Avengers?
Endgame. Yeah.
Right. I mean, most of Hollywood is pretty secular, liberal, all this sort of stuff, and yet it ends with this incredible Christ figure moment when Iron Man.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And better than that, even though Hollywood, so much of it has jumped on this radical environmentalist bandwagon that says people are the. I'm not talking about stewardship of nature. We do that. We're Christians. But the radical agenda that so many have jumped on, and yet it turns out that a myth will not allow you to say that. The bad guy's the one who snaps his finger and eliminates half the human population. So myth is so powerful that they can't beat it. They try to be politically incorrect, and they end up being pulled back in because all of those mythic stories are telling us of the need for self-sacrifice and the power of that self-sacrifice.
And this is great. It had me thinking. I was looking up a passage in the Lord of the Rings here. There's a couple things that I was reminded of. I wanted to bring up here. But the first thing I think is you've been alluding to this. We can't think and experience at the same time. That myth addresses. It's somewhere in that space in between. Well, that's the tragic dilemma that he talks about in that same essay. To either know and to not taste, or to know to taste and to not know. And myth is sort of a partial resolution of that tragic dilemma. I think that's what we've been getting at. Lewis always had a way with words, and so did Tolkien. And I was reminded, secondly, of in the course of excellent response he just gave about empiricism, logical positivism, as you mentioned earlier. I'm reminded of this in the Riders of Rohan, in the second part of the Lord of the Rings, in the Two Towers, when Éomer and Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas first encounter each other. And I think one of the riders standing beside Éomer, he says, "Halflings, they are only little people in old songs. And do we walk in legends or in the green earth in the daylight?" Now, this is an interesting response Aragorn gives. He's a philosopher here, maybe the philosopher king, very Platonic.
Yeah.
"A man may do both," said Aragorn, "for not we, but those who come after will make the legends of our time. The green earth, say you, that is a mighty matter of legend, though you tread it under the light of day." That is, we'll get into this conversation about reason. I think one of the big objections is that people can't accept myths as true propositions, expressions about reality, because their reason can't prove that it's true. But reason can't prove reason is true. Reason, right? Reason is a tree that, and I've got this from Michael Ward, who wrote an essay about Lewis and reason and the imagination. I think he says that reason is like the tree that is relying upon and the root system of the imagination, which is the soil. And without the imagination, reason would be cut off and be in midair. It would have nothing to rely upon for its interpretation of meaning. So it's very interesting. And then Aragorn here in this passage, he's saying, look, you take for granted the fact that you think that the green earth under your feet is real, but even that is under question, because you can't live up to your own standards, this empirical materialistic worldview today. So I guess what Aragorn is saying, just like Ward in his essay, is that all thinking, especially our faculty of reason, relies upon the imagination. And imagination is the organ of meaning, Lewis says, and the imagination is the heart of myth. And so it's great. And mythology, we've also, I think, learned from Dr. Markos here, is that this thing that addresses that tragic split, to taste and to not know, or to know and to not taste. It gives it to us. If we overanalyze it, you said, you're so right, we turn it into an allegory, except we can't avoid doing this, because we want to understand how the great stories affect us. So that leads me to just, I guess, our next little side topic that's off the tracks a little bit. I was just thinking about the Space Trilogy. I haven't read through it all by Lewis, but some of the comments I've read through scholars commenting on that, that Lewis, like I think Barfield before him too, had this thought that this all happened, this sacred secular split, this inability to think in a unified way occurred at the fall. I think I understand that right? He talks about this in other writings, that since the fall of Adam and Eve, we have an inability to think and know, or to taste and experience and to know at the same time. There's a subject-object split now. There's a mythos-logos split, and we can't think in a unified way. So I think it's interesting.
We either look at the sunbeam, the beam of light, or we look along it. Right? Remember that?
Yeah, the meditation in a tool shed. Yeah.
It's fun. And it's funny, because I love what you just read from Lord of the Rings, but I almost expect you to read, is it when they're in Rivendell, or is it when they're in Lothlorien, that it's like living in a song?
Oh, yes.
It's just now. That's the closest to that sort of direct perception of reality that we catch in glimpses. One of the reasons we love to go to Narnia and Middle Earth is it gives us those glimpses, right? Every so often, and then we pull back. But for a second, we are living in a song, and the gold is flowing, and it's just unbelievable.
It is.
And it's funny what you just said. This is how Lewis ends his essay, Myth Made Fact, or Myth Became Fact. He says, we must not, in false spirituality, withhold our imaginative welcome, right? Because Christ he's more than bolder, because he's real and historical, but he's not less than bolder. He still speaks to the deep regions of our heart and our spirit and our soul, the way myth does, right? And so he says, look, if God chooses to be mythopoeic, if God chooses to speak to us mythically, and is not the sky itself a myth?
That's just what Aragorn said.
You think Lewis and Tolkien like that?
I think they conspired.
The green earth is a legend. I mean, they're saying the same thing.
Yes, they are. Yeah.
Isn't that wonderful?
It is.
Not the sky itself a myth, shall we refuse to be mythopathic? For this is the marriage of heaven and earth. Perfect myth and perfect fact. He's talking about Jesus, claiming not only our love and our obedience, but also our wonder and our delight. Rest to the savage, the child, and the poet in each one of us, no less than to the moralist, the scholar, and the philosopher. That's how the essay ends. And all of that is based on the night walk he had with Tolkien, where he
Yes.
realized Christ was the myth made fact, which is the title of my book.
Yeah, which I want to get into.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a powerful closing, and I know you and I both love that myth became fact essay, which he wrote in the 40s. Very, very powerful stuff, and I guess that would be a great segue, because I think we've addressed a lot of the things I had on the outline about reason and the imagination, but maybe just to kind of clarify going forward. So we can probably safely say that for modern people maybe struggling with this, that things that are real and therefore true, I suppose, to the imagination, or things can be imaginatively real or true. Is that right?
Yeah.
And reason doesn't have to prove it, because imagination and myth is not irrational, but maybe non-rational would be a better way of putting it.
Yes, that is a good way.
Okay.
It's not irrational. It's
Right.
non-rational or irrational.
Right.
It
That's
transcends reason. You know what it is? It's
precisely.
sort of like Lewis complains about this in Miracles.
Mm.
Why do we always use negative language about God and about heaven? So
Oh,
we're corporeal. God
right.
is non-corporeal. God's not non-corporeal. He's transcorporeal.
Right.
He's more than we are, not less than we are, right? God is not impersonal. God is transpersonal. And the
Mm-hmm.
same thing about heaven. Heaven will be not less than the earth, but more than the
More.
earth.
Yeah.
Physical, but in a way we can't even imagine, that
Yeah.
only our myths can point us towards.
That's right. Okay, good. I want to make sure going forward that people understood that we clarified that Middle Earth and Narnia is more real than the seat you're sitting on right now. So we
Very
just
good.
want to make sure. Very good. So I think that'll give plenty of our audience things to think about over the next 24 hours, maybe longer. That's wonderful. So thank you for those excellent commentaries on the questions we have. So let's talk more about your book, because I had some favorite chapters. No offense to the other chapters. I love the whole book. But I was struck today just reviewing, and I think this is in chapter 42, about the brother and sister pair from Aeschylus's plays, Electra and Orestes. The Oresteia is am I right, is the only surviving trilogy from the Greeks,
Yes.
the ancient Greeks, which is so sad.
It is sad.
But so grateful that we have this one, because it's my favorite. Um, I'd like to talk about Orestes and Electra, but I have a few others. And what I'd like to read first for our audience is on page 23, I think, of the introduction that you give as an excellent introduction, Roman numeral 23. This is the thesis of Dr. Markos's book, and I think it's a beautiful summary of everything he and I have talked about so far, and then as a great launch pad for addressing these chapters. And I know you have it on the outline, but I've got chapter 3 on Homer and the Odyssey, chapters 35 and 37, or through 37, Sophocles' plays about Oedipus, and then the Oresteia chapters 41 through 43. So we'll talk about those in a minute, but here is Dr. Markos's thesis for this great book. In the spirit of Lewis, this book will seek to mine wisdom of eternal value from the great storehouses of Greco-Roman mythology and trace the links that bind those myths to the Bible and to the Christian life. For, by presenting Christ as the historical embodiment of the Corn King, Lewis did more than convert one of the more traditional arguments against Christianity. That is, for those of you listening, it's often said that Christ is just a myth, into a powerful argument for Christianity. And we'll get to that in a few minutes. Christ fulfills, after all, Dr. Markos says, both Jewish law and pagan myth. He also helped modern Christians reclaim myth, Lewis, as a vehicle of truth through which the presence of the triune God can be discerned. To me, that was a great summary of your book. So thank you for that. It's so beautiful. And we have this thing that it's going to be interesting to people listening. A lot of people probably are aware that often Christianity gets lumped in as just one other myth, one other archetype, except the Jewish version of these other dying and rising archetypes. But Lewis and you, I would argue, have turned around this argument against Christianity into a great argument that not a lot of people are using enough for Christianity. So I would like to talk about that first, and then we can delve into some of those chapters. And I have some other questions that I think you'll find interesting. But
again,
yeah.
we said it so many times, the origin of the phrase, the myth made fact, or the myth
Yeah.
became fact, right?
Right.
Most people know that Lewis was an atheist before he became a Christian.
Sure.
A lot of people don't know, though, that he didn't go directly from one to the other.
Mhm.
First, he became a theist, a believer in God, and it took him another year to year and a half before he came to believe that Jesus was the Son of God. What was holding him back? One of the things that was holding him back was he was a big fan of Sir James Frazer, the what was that guy's name? The one that influenced George
Golden.
Lucas.
Oh yeah, Joseph Campbell. Yeah.
Joseph Campbell of his day. He
Hmm.
studied all the different myths and legends and kind of lined them up and came up with certain recurring archetypes, these images that kept coming. And one of them was the dying god, the
Mm.
Osiris or Adonis or Bacchus or Balder or Tammuz or Mithras, all of these different ones.
Yeah.
And
Oh, wow.
Lewis, like you said a moment ago, he thought, well, Jesus was just the Hebrew version of this myth.
Hmm.
And one night at Magdalen College, Oxford, while they were walking along Addison's Walk, one of my favorite places, and as they walked along there, Tolkien said to Lewis, Jack, his nickname, did you ever think maybe the reason Jesus sounds like a myth is because he's the myth that became true, that was made fact? And that within a week or so, Lewis had become a believer because he
Right.
suddenly realized that use a quick analogy.
Yeah.
One of the greatest arguments people use against God is, if there's a God, why is there so much injustice in the world? To which I answer, if there was no God, you wouldn't know that the world was unjust.
Right.
If there was no
Right.
God, if all there was survival of the fittest, there would be no such thing as justice. Okay,
Yes.
and we come
Yes.
back here. A lot of people think that Christians are just stealing from these myths,
Yes.
but no, in Christ, we find the fulfillment not only of the Jewish law and prophets, but of the yearnings of the pagan people. Lewis basically intimates that when Jesus came, if yes, he fulfilled the law and prophets, but if what he did had no connection whatsoever to all of the things that the pagans were yearning for, it would seem, Michael, as if a foreign God had invaded the world.
Oh, yeah.
But in fact, what happens is, again, Jesus said, I come not to break the law, but fulfill it. Well, I would add, I come not to break the myths, but to fulfill them.
That's
Because he
beautiful.
is the true corn king. He
Yes.
is the true seed that dies and is buried and therefore produces much fruit.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So
See, that's beautiful.
this is the reality. Okay.
Yeah.
The reality is life, death, and rebirth, the seasonal cycle that's written into our psyche, into our consciousness, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
it actually, Lewis said somewhere in Surprised by Joy, his first autobiography, that one thing that pushed him on the road to faith is when he saw a fellow professor that was completely atheist. He said, you know what? All that Fraser stuff about the dying God seems like it really happened once. Wrong thing. And Lewis, what are you saying? This guy was an atheist. But suddenly he realized that there's this deep, deep reality that's got to be pointing towards something. And what Christianity says is this was the moment when it all came together. So Jesus is the fulfilled Joshua, right?
Yes.
But he's also the true Hercules, the true Orpheus, the true Orestes.
I love that. And I'm going to play skeptic though, because you know that I understand and love the argument. But here's what I hear from a lot of my students. Why don't all the myths point toward Islam or Norse mythology or Buddhism? And this is the thing they always ask me in my classes. We talk about myth in chapter 3, unit 3 of the intro class. Well, why does it have to be Christianity? That kind of seems like a conspiracy. You're a Christian, aren't you, Professor? Yeah. Okay. So that must be, I mean, that's convenient, don't you think? And I said, well, it's not about me or Dr. Markos or Christian A or B. It's because these point to facts. That's why I believe it. But I think that's a good question. Maybe we can clarify. Why don't all myths point to somebody else?
Where I read this, but in one of his essays, Lewis says that in some ways there's only two religions, Christianity and Islam. I'm sorry, Christianity and Hinduism, because every other religion either leads up to it or leads away from it. Okay, so Judaism is pointing the way to Christianity. Islam is a movement away from, it's basically a return to Judaism. I mean, what's the difference between Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God, thy Lord is one, and there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet? I mean, basically, Islam is a return to a radical monotheism. Or we could also say it's the most successful Christian heresy of all time. I don't want to make fun, but it is.
No, that is. That's a good way to put it.
It's a denial of Trinity, incarnation, all of it.
Resurrection, all of it.
So and the same way Buddhism, in some ways, is a heresy of Hinduism, right? That doesn't mean it's a bad religion, but it's a movement away from that. So what he says is the only place where we find these truths in their fullness are in those two religions. Now let's put them beside, okay? Hinduism not only has no real historical basis for its stories, but it's also, full of horrors. I mean,
that is true.
sacred prostitution, all that sort of stuff. So
yeah,
Christianity,
that is true.
where do we find this truth in its fullness? One time I was talking with a Muslim, and there was a man with me who was actually a cultural Christian. I don't even think he was a believer. But suddenly he turned to the Muslim guy, and in a nice way, he said, "Tell me one new thing that Islam added." And I thought, wow, that's a powerful. And the guy couldn't, because there is nothing. It's a return to Judaism. It doesn't
I can't think
advance
of anything.
It goes backwards.
That's so true.
As does Unitarianism.
Sure.
The Da Vinci Code is merely a return to Gnosticism. It is
that
not
is a good way.
Forward, it is a movement backward. Right?
I
And if
didn't
we
think of
only
that.
studied our church fathers and all that, we wouldn't be fooled by these heresies that keep coming up again and again and again. And again.
Trying to get people to study today is not just a problem for students, but you're right.
That's the idea. It's in its fullness. It is. I mean, people that say Jesus is not a historical character, they just don't know what they're talking about.
Oh, no, not at all.
And also, one of my favorite things, though, is people that say, "Oh, well, read the Gospels. They're obviously just fantasy." And I said, the only way you can say something like that is if you've actually read no other ancient literature. True. If you put the Gospels next to a book that was written one generation earlier, Ovid's Metamorphoses, you will immediately see the difference. Okay. Let's put it this way, right? Michael, the only reason we can read Ovid with joy is because we know it's not true. If we even had an inkling that a person could turn into a tree or an insect or a bird or a rock, we would run screaming. But it's only because we believe the miracles of Jesus are true that we say, yes, everything is okay now. Okay, well, God has come into the world. God has enacted what all the people of the world have been yearning for. And it's where do we find it in its fullness?
Yeah. So I don't know why people are having such a hard time with this conspiracy kind of framework for this, because it's based on a narrative that makes the most complete sense of the facts. And I think I did an interview recently where I said just that. I had a question about, well, if we're comparing narratives, if we're looking at myths as narrated worldviews and we're doing comparative religions, I said, I think one of the great qualities that a myth, a worldview must have is its ability to explain the existence and origin of other myths. And I don't think that any, if you were to take Hinduism or any of the isms and try to make sense of Christianity, I don't think you could. Yeah. And so I think it's a really important thing that people need to understand, that this isn't something we believe because we're loading the game, we're trying to load the deck, I guess, as it were, but because this is what leads us, the statements about reality that Christianity makes. It tells us that we should expect to find images in the minds of the pagan poets, and that, and also that it leads to an illumination about the way the world really is, and not because we want it to be true, but because it is when we actually follow it to its logical conclusion. So,
and you know what, Michael, connecting back to an earlier point we made, only once you eliminate the facts value split can you understand that Christianity is a consistent, coherent worldview, which is the lens through which you can see everything. As long as you keep the mythic side out, then Christianity is robbed of half of its power and half of its explanatory power. Absolutely. It lens through which we can perceive everything else.
Well said. So
we need the fullness of that revelation, the fullness with which God appeals to us, heart, soul, mind, and strength. Right? All of it.
That's right. That's right. The whole person.
Yeah, the whole person. It's holistic.
Exactly. And just another side comment too. Yeah, that's beautiful. The people that say, oh, Jesus wasn't a historical person, I like to gently point them to Bart Ehrman, whose works as a historian I really respect and have read. I don't know where he stands today with his beliefs, but I know that he has written a whole book about the answer is yes, Jesus was a real historical person. Anybody that says otherwise is really taking something, because this is really an undeniable fact. In fact, we know so much more about Jesus than we would about Muhammad, Buddha, Confucius, Alexander the Great, even somebody I did my research on as an undergraduate, and I realized how far removed the biographies of Arian and others were.
400 years later.
Yeah, at least. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I'm thinking, wow, this is really remarkable. Oh, but we don't have the New Testament originals. We don't have the autographs. But okay, we don't. Yes, but look at the gap. It's this small. Yeah. You don't have that anywhere else. And besides, there's more. So that's another thing. Look at the works of Bart Ehrman. those out there in the audience, if you want to see, I think, an agnostic's take on the
Yes.
historicity of Jesus, that would be a
And by the
good.
way, though, Bart Ehrman is a good cautionary tale for us, Michael, because
Yeah.
as far as I can tell, Bart Ehrman is somebody that grew up in a overly fundamentalist home. They told him the Bible has no contradictions in a logical positivist way. He goes off to college. Somebody shows him a contradiction. He throws off his faith.
Yes.
And he's got a lot to answer for, actually. But
Absolutely.
but I mean, that really is a cautionary tale.
Yes, it is.
That we have got to not, hold ourselves to a vision of reality that is not only 250 years old, that is actually often opposed to Christianity. This is the whole point. And so it's
true. I think we've got a lot of work to do, but I really think, as we've been saying,
it's funny because
go ahead.
It's crazy. One of the things that's done so much damage to people into Christianity is the modern psychiatric movement, which is completely secular humanist. And yet, at the same time, if the psychiatrists are honest and they look at the Gospels, they will find that Jesus is like no other human personality in history. How come
not crazy?
A perfectly balanced person.
Yeah, they've had
you can't invent this kind of a character.
No, you can't. You've had psychologists, psychiatrists, and I think legal scholars all take a look at the Gospels. I think, was it Robert Greenleaf or something to that extent, a lawyer from an Ivy League school some years ago that looked at the Gospels and passed it through kind of a legal litmus test. And psychologists have looked at this, and this goes back to Lewis's famous trilemma, liar, lunatic, or Lord. He certainly isn't a liar and certainly isn't a lunatic, so it leaves the only feasible option. I want to spend the last section of today's interview. We'll go just a little over an hour, if that's okay with you. I want to talk about the rest of your book, and so these chapters. I know you say here. I think this is, what page is this? 277. That Orestes is he's not a perfect Christian hero, but he is ancient Greece's most powerful messianic figure. I've always kind of intuited that, and intuition and myth go hand in hand, but the way you've unpacked it is just brilliant. But I'd like to back up first to maybe Odysseus and any other glimmers of the gospel you can see in Homer's works, and then kind of go chronologically through, just briefly, if you will. I don't want to take too much more of your time. Oedipus and Orestes.
Well, it's great because when you're looking at Odysseus and when you're looking at Orestes, you're looking at your book too. When you talk about Aragorn as the return of the king, and you point out so many of the parables take for granted the return of the king.
Yes.
And when one of my favorite lines, I know you like this too, is when unfortunately it's not in the movie, when they go back to the Prancing Pony and they meet Mr. Butterbur, right? Barlim and Butterbur, and it's like, the king. Who's the king? Strider's the king. It's wonderful. But
this guy,
they say something like, soon Aragorn will turn his eye this way, and somehow that will clean up the roads, right? As if the gaze of the will bring things to right, right?
Yes.
Right. And
brilliant.
This is, the Odyssey. Judgment Day comes to Ithaca. And again, we don't see this. That's what's amazing about it. In one sense, at first, we might think this is Achilles all over again, just killing everybody like he does at the end of the year. But no, there's a justice here, right? That he is the messianic figure that must save the hope. And yet, I would still argue that as we move, I don't remember what critic first said this, but the Odyssey is a little bit more ethical than the Iliad.
Yeah.
The tragedies are a little bit more ethical than that, and we're moving down like that. So once we get to Orestes is justified ultimately in killing his mother because he's setting things to right, and yet we have a sort of deeper moral dilemma where now he is chased off, tormented by the Furies, in a sense, his own conscience tormenting him until he can find an even higher resolution than Homer knew about. So there is a development, I would argue, Christologically, as we move from Odysseus to Orestes, to a sense that no, just coming back and setting things to right by killing the bad guys is not enough. We need something much deeper and much richer. And in one of the most amazing moments in all of literature, at the end of the third part of the Oresteia is called the Eumenides.
Yes.
And at the end, Orestes is declared innocent, everything's fine, but
Hmm.
it's not fine because
No.
those old furies, the old mind of the past, the eye for an eye in the negative sense of the word,
Yep.
they can't be just brushed under the rug.
No.
They need to be domesticated
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
transformed
Right.
from the furies into the humanities, the well-minded ones,
That's right.
the kindly ones. So, and
Yeah. Yeah.
in
Wow.
Greek mythology, there's a development of understanding exactly what it takes
Hmm.
to really bring about that true reconciliation.
Yes.
Right, because
This is beautiful.
it's not just creation, fall, redemption. It's creation, fall, redemption, reconciliation.
That's right.
And the Oresteia ends not just with the redemption, but with the reconciliation.
Yeah, the first trial in Western history
Yeah,
too, I think, has been said. Now, for those of you listening, you don't know the Greek background here. I think it was Hesiod in the Theogony who explained the origin of the Furies. They were chthonic deities that were born of the droplets of the blood of Uranos, the sky god who was castrated, right? I think by Kronos.
the Chronos. Yeah,
And yeah, and the testicles, I think, of the sky god fell into the ocean, produced Aphrodite.
Aphrodite, right,
Yeah, but the blood droplets, I think, hit the ground
right.
and mixed to form these vengeance deities. But as Dr. Markos has just explained, they're pacified and placated and reconciled. I think, but is it the goddess Athena, right?
It's by Athena, yeah, the
Yeah,
goddess
in
of
the
reason, who
trial.
came out of the head of Zeus.
Of
What
course,
is Athena?
yes,
Athena is a kind of a virgin birth.
absolutely. Yeah,
You know?
yeah, that's right. Wow.
And right, she doesn't attack them. She beckons them. She urges them to come in. And what
Oh,
happens is
huh.
they end up becoming protective goddesses of marriage and childbirth,
Oh, I didn't know that detail.
which is wonderful at the end, you know?
Wow.
And,
Huh.
and, and that's a powerful thing. And I often ask my students,
No kidding.
which of these relationships is more essential to civilization? The
Mm,
relationship between parents and children, or husband and wife? And all of them immediately say children and parents, but no, that's not the answer. Even bad people love their children. The
true.
center is a covenant, the covenant that
Yes.
God made with Israel, the covenant made with us, the
Yes.
covenant of marriage. These are the things that raise us, because even animals protect their young.
Sure.
Uh,
Yeah, it's a natural instinct.
Entering into a covenant is,
Yes.
is the highest point of civilization, and they're
Absolutely.
moving towards that. And so the goddesses end up
Beautiful.
protecting
Mm,
marriage at the end.
it's incredible. And a little insight, I believe the Hebrew word for covenant is berith, and it means marriage contract.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I believe that's right. I'd have to look it up, but if memory serves, so that is just too true and wonderful.
Aragorn and Arwen. We've got to have the
Yeah,
great marriage at the end.
absolutely. Yeah, I talk about that in my book as well, and I think it's a great foretaste of the marriage of heaven and earth, and the one that we already taste now, in part, and so we have our already and not yet aspects. But
Human sexuality points towards the marriage of Christ and the church. That's what Paul says.
wow,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
For this cause shall a man, leave his father and mother, cleave to his wife, the two will be one flesh. I speak of a great mystery, but I speak with reference to Christ and the church. So
yes,
human
that's
marriage
right.
and sexuality are pointing forward. And you
Yes.
need to understand the mystery of sexuality, marriage, and heaven, and
Mm.
also Christ himself. It's the same mystery of the incarnation, the two into one, that two could become one and yet remain two.
See, that's a brilliant connection.
I mean,
Yeah,
because you
yeah,
see, the idea of heaven is in Christianity, in heaven, we will be with God and we will be one with God, but we
right.
will still be ourselves. None of this one soul idea from
No,
Hinduism and Buddhism and the
no,
New Age. We
that's
will
right.
still be who we are, yet one. That is the great mystery, that
Wow,
Jesus could be fully God and fully man at the same time.
beautiful.
These are the amazing mysteries.
Yes, and these foretastes we're getting in myths are so powerful once we view it from that retrospective Emmaus Road
Good
perspective
way to
in
put
Luke
it. Yeah, that's
24,
a good way to
right?
put it. Yes.
Yeah, and I think you make a point in one of your appendices of your books, which I've enjoyed as an educator. I'm going to be citing you a lot
Oh,
probably
good.
this semester, so thank you.
Good.
You say, hey, good luck, but wading into Hindu mythology is admirable, but it's tough.
It's
You wonder, I think you muse about what other authors might do to look into other mythological systems, China, Japan, the Native Americans, etc., and to see what foretastes we can find there. And I've always wondered, somebody should really, maybe this will be your next book, to wade into some of these other world mythologies to do what you've done here. But it is quite a task, I think, because some of those mythologies
And
are
you know
so
what?
complex.
You probably know this. One of the
Yeah.
differences between Greco-Roman and Norse is
Mm.
that we don't have any of the original Norse
Yeah,
myth.
that's
We
true.
only have those myths filtered through what are basically Christian writers. So
Yeah,
we don't
that's
have
right.
Homer, Hesiod, Ovid, all of that sort of stuff. And so in
That's
some
true.
ways, what we have of Norse mythology has already been
Pass through
brought
filter.
together, right?
Yeah,
Where
that's
you
right.
have so much of the original Greek, and we also have the original Egyptian.
True.
And again,
Yeah.
I always shy away from Egyptian because it's so sort of terrifying. And yet, at the very core of Egyptian
Yeah.
mythology, the Book of the Dead, is we
Hmm.
come to the judge, and he judges our soul against a feather.
Yeah.
I
Isn't
mean,
that
what
something?
a powerful, proto-Christian metaphor
Absolutely.
of sin is not only something that cuts us off from God, it is heavy. It
Mm.
drags us down, as Plato knows in all of his myths. In
Yep.
fact, Plato says, you know what the origin of ghosts is? Because the bad dead person, his soul is so heavy with
Mm.
his sin and all that it weighs him down, and he's weighed
Wow.
right back down to his body, and that's why ghosts are hovering around cemeteries. Isn't that
That
wild?
makes beautiful sense. It is. See, myths we can glimpse, realities we could not through reason. It's beautiful. I wanted to talk a little bit about Oedipus, but before we do, just a sidebar into something. I know we both love Dr. Michael Heiser, and
Oh,
we've both
great.
been
I
on his
just did a
podcast.
Friday.
Yeah,
2 days
yeah,
ago, I did a podcast with him.
yeah. And this is your second or third, I think, with
My
him.
third, yeah.
Yeah, your third. So I've got to listen to one of the other ones, but I've done one with him back in November, I think. And this is something I had wanted to talk with him about. But, fun question. I get a lot of students who always kind of get wild eyed, the ones that really have big imaginations. They like to think, if we can view the way Heiser looks at the Old Testament story of the scattering of the nations, the Deuteronomy 32, Genesis 11 worldview, as he calls it, these other nations and the sons of God on the divine council are disinherited. And these other nations, like Greece and Rome and Egypt, you might imagine, are put under the dominion of these fallen Elohim. Okay, I guess some questions I've got from students, are these other gods real? And Heiser says, yes, they're real in a sense. They're contingent on Yahweh, but it's kind of interesting to think: are these other deities, still in charge of the other nations? So some of my students say, do you think Zeus and all the Greek gods and goddesses are real? And it's such a childlike question.
Yeah.
So from a biblical point of view, I know that this is very challenging for a lot of people. The grasping the divine counsel is a whole nother subject, but what do you think about that? I mean, do you
Well,
have any
Michael, are you
students?
familiar with what's called the 1040 window? Have you ever heard that?
1040 window? No.
It refers to longitude, latitude, and it's it's like there's a block of darkness over all these countries, over all of North Africa, the Muslim countries, the atheist country. It's just
No.
like there's a block of darkness, and it's all in a block
Huh.
there. And it's almost, and there's a lot of people. I'm not Pentecostal, but I read everything, and a
Yeah.
lot of people that are prayer warriors are praying to break down the darkness of that area of the world. So maybe there
No.
still is I mean, we know that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. We don't want to
Yes.
look for a demon under every rock, but
No.
I
No.
mean, in
No.
the same way that there are really such thing as angels, there really are such thing as demons.
Yes.
And
Absolutely.
the one that I did with Michael Heiser, the second
Mm.
one, was about Paradise Lost. And
Mm.
basically, my reading of Milton is he's saying that if you look at all of the really bad gods,
Mm.
okay, in Paradise Lost, all of his demons get the names of the evil demons of Egypt and Philistine. Their Dagon and their Moloch and their Baal and stuff.
Oh,
Whereas the
I didn't know that.
Greco-Roman Norse ones, he treats them as not good, but as dwelling in a sort of cold middle air. There's a
Oh,
sort of
wow.
difference between, because, again, when you look at not only the Bible, but the Greco-Roman, there is a dichotomy between East and West. But by
Hmm.
East, we don't mean China. By East, we
Mm.
mean the Babylonians, we mean the Persians, we mean the Philistines, we mean the Phoenicians. We also include the Egyptians and the Carthaginians in North
Hmm.
Africa. That whole area, they're the people that stand against the Jews, but also against the Greeks and Romans. Right.
Right.
So
Yeah.
Chesterton, in his great book, The Everlasting Man, he
Hmm.
says that God had raised up the Jews to do away with the Phoenicians, the people that sacrificed their babies to Baal, but they
Yes.
failed to
Pagan.
do it.
Right.
And those Phoenicians became the Carthaginians. And so God raised up the good pagans to finish and end that. So it's a wild way of sort of looking at history. That's what the everlasting man is. It's a Christian way of looking at history. And it was meant to be an answer to an outline of history by the very secular humanist H.G. Wells.
Yes. Okay.
Pretty much the myth of the caveman. Now there's a myth. If you want any myth that's unreal, the caveman.
Oh yeah. That's another podcast. I love. I've got to read the Everlasting Man. I've not actually finished it, but
it's great.
Yeah, that sounds great. That's exactly what I was getting at. A kind of a Christian view of history. But I think this Heiser stuff really helps us to understand that. These other dark powers under the that are held under the dominion of or hold the other nations under their dominion. So I think that's interesting. I have not heard of the 1040 window. I'll have to check that out. It's really a very, very new topic to me. So thank you. Yeah, I think, is there anything else you'd like to add? I mean, this has been a great program. I'm just about out of questions.
It's great. Well, just to mention that the book, The Myth Made Fact, that's Classical Academic Press, but they also have something called Classical University, which is one of those subscription services. And they had me do an 18-part, 9-hour lecture series based on my book, but I don't read the book out loud. I retell it. I'm addressing the kind of like I'm doing now, addressing the camera. And that's one of those things though where you need to be subscribed. But it's kind of neat if you want to experience it that way. And it's one of those things where it is audio video, but kind of like what we're doing today. You could just listen to it and get everything. We're not you and I are not relying on visuals here.
Right.
A lot of people will listen to this rather than watch it.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So that was exciting to do. And the other fun thing, you'll appreciate this, Michael, because you're a writer here, is something happened to me that's never happened before. My original version of The Myth Made Fact was about 60,000 words. I gave it to Classical Academic. They said, we love this, but we want twice as much. What publisher ever tells you to write more?
Unheard of.
So they're the ones that really encouraged me to expand every chapter to bring in all those deeper questions. And, these are yes and no questions, but these are ones that are going to help you to explore the nature of reality, and the Bible verses are there. So again, I'm hoping that this will, reach a very wide audience. It's also a beautiful coffee table book. I mean, didn't they do a nice job with it?
They really did. Everything,
so pleased.
The Greek border, the architectural frieze border. Yeah. Everything is beautiful. Great. Nice. That vase orange, that the antique vases or vases had. So great, really great book. I will include in the description for the podcast, today's episode, and the YouTube, a link to Classical Academic Press. I know there are a lot of extra resources, and I think they have a series of PowerPoints and
extra PowerPoints in particular.
Yeah, which are great. I think I pre-ordered the book, so I got access to Bullfinch's the audio for the myths and also the PowerPoint. So I'll make sure I share that with folks. It was really great to meet you.
Well, thanks, Mike. It's so good to be here. And like I said, Godspeed with this endeavor you're doing here. We need to get the word out about myth, and I think it's going to help bring back a broken unity.
Yes.
Right? Bring back what's his name? Owen Barfield called original participation. Bring it back. He was one of the Inklings.
And the mother tongue that he talked about. I think that without that separation between subject and object. Yeah, beautiful. Man is not a myth, I think Charlie Starr said, and that is a sad fact. And I agree with him. I love the way he worded that. So that's great. Well, thank you, Dr. Markos, again.
Great talking to you, and blessings for the new year, Michael.
You as well.
Take care.